Chapter 12 of Napoleon I, An Intimate Biography, by Walter Geer. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. 1805. Austerlitz. On the 2nd of January, 1805, a month after his coronation, Napoleon wrote a personal letter to George III proposing peace. He still had his mind set on his plan of colonial expansion, to which Great Britain was the greatest obstacle. French trade had been driven from the seas, and French fleets were blockaded in their ports. Some of the West India Islands had again passed into the hands of England, and Napoleon had been forced to sell Louisiana to save it from the same fate. England had not evacuated Malta as agreed, and London had become a hotbed of royalist conspiracies against Napoleon's person and government. A superb army had been assembled at Boulogne for the invasion of England. The Pacific Addington had retired from office, and Pitt, the great war leader, had returned to power. His first move had been to form the Third Coalition against France. The King's reply to Napoleon's overtures was that he must consult the Continental Powers, and in particular Russia, before giving a definite answer. The Tsar had been much mortified by the secondary part which he had played in the settlement of affairs in Germany after the Peace of Lunéville. In October 1803, the Austrian government was invited to make arrangements for joint action with Russia, but shrunk from the prospect of another war. A year later, in November 1804, she finally agreed to sign a declaration, but not a treaty, by which the two powers undertook to resist further French aggressions in Italy and Germany. At length, on the 11th of April, 1805, a formal treaty was signed, by which the two powers agreed to form a European League for the restoration of peace and of the balance of power. Holland, Switzerland, and Italy were to be freed from French control. England promised to pay a large annual subsidy for the maintenance of the troops employed against France. At a moment when it seemed possible that the coalition might fall through, Napoleon brought the matter to a head by his decision to assume the crown of Italy. He had first offered the crown to Joseph, and then, on his refusal, to Louis, but both declined to give up their rights to the imperial succession for a nominal kingship. Napoleon therefore announced his decision to himself assume the Iron Crown of Lombardy. In June, Genoa was formally annexed to the empire, and Lucca turned into a principality for Elisa. Shortly afterwards Parma was also annexed. By these steps all Italy west of the Adige and north of Tuscany was brought under the direct rule of Napoleon. As we have already seen, Napoleon arrived at Fontainebleau on his return from Italy on the 11th of July. After remaining there a week, he went to St. Cloud with Josephine, and the night of his arrival they attended the opera, where Napoleon received a warm reception. He then proceeded to Boulogne, where he held a review of the army which had been assembled for the invasion of England. On the 7th of July, Francis II signed the formal orders for the mobilization of the Austrian armies, and on the 22nd Villeneuve, after an indecisive action with the English fleet off Ferrol, set sail for Cadiz instead of Brest as ordered by the Emperor. News traveled very slowly in those days, and definite reports of these two events did not reach Napoleon at Boulogne until the second week in August. It will always remain a mooted question whether Napoleon was really serious in his intention of invading England, but the weight of evidence seems to be in the affirmative. But whatever his intentions may have been, he was now forced to change his plans. Calling Daru, the commissary general of the army, to his headquarters at Pont de Brique, a small chateau a league from Boulogne, where he stayed when he went to inspect the ocean camps, at 4 o'clock in the morning he began to dictate, unhesitatingly and in his usual concise manner, the plan of the 1805 campaign as far as Vienna. When he had finished at 9 o'clock, he ordered Daru to leave at once for Paris, and with the utmost secrecy prepare with General de Jean, the Minister of War, the detailed orders for the marches. Napoleon himself also set out for the capital, where on the 27th of August he signed the official marching orders, directing the steps of the Grand Army towards the Rhine. The newspapers were strictly enjoined not to publish any reports of these movements of the troops, and Napoleon remained quietly at St. Cloud until the 23rd of September, in order to lull any suspicions of the Allies. At the same time that the Emperor dictated his plan of campaign on the 13th of August, he instructed Talleyrand, Minister of Foreign Affairs, to demand of the Austrian government that it should immediately disband its army, and to intimate that if he did not have assurance on this subject within 2 weeks, the Emperor Francis should not celebrate the Christmas festival in Vienna. In many respects Austerlitz is the most interesting of all Napoleon's campaigns. It was the first in which he commanded as Emperor. The army was much the largest which he had yet had under his orders, and according to his own statement it was the best he ever commanded. The final victory was the most brilliant and the most decisive he ever won, a real chef d'oeuvre of battles of which he was always very proud. It may therefore be of interest to speak here of some of the generals who won undying glory under Napoleon's leadership, and to examine briefly his method of conducting his campaigns. The Grand Army had been encamped for 2 years on the shores of the Channel, wholly engaged in military exercises. Napoleon had occupied this time in perfecting its organization, and never was there anything finer or more martial. The system of divisions employed during the Revolution had been abandoned, and the army was organized in 7 corps, of from 2 to 4 divisions each, commanded by marshals. There were also powerful reserves of cavalry, and the Imperial Guard. The marshals were all men tried in many battles, but all were not at first given assignments. Bernadotte had the First Corps. Astute, calm, selfish, calculating, of more polished manners than most of the marshals, he had considerable powers of command, but Napoleon never fully trusted him, and perhaps employed him in the field because he thought it dangerous to leave him behind in France. Marmont, formerly an aide de camp and an artillery officer, commanded the Second Corps, although he had not yet been made marshal. Davout was at the head of the Third Corps. With the exception only of Masséna, he was the ablest of the marshals. He was a stern disciplinarian, but popular with his men, for whose comfort he was ever solicitous. Soult was placed in charge of the Fourth Corps. He was a man of large frame, with an active mind. In Switzerland and at Genoa he had given proofs of superior talents. He was a capable commander, but he was detested by his subordinates. Lannes had the Fifth Corps. He had first attracted the attention of Napoleon by his bravery in Italy, where he promoted him on the field of battle. He had watched Lannes' progress as a commander and seen him steadily improve. He said of him at St. Helena, "He was a pygmy when I took him, a giant when I lost him." Napoleon had for him a warmer feeling of friendship than for any of his other marshals. At his deathbed the Emperor could not control his grief. Lannes feared the Emperor no more than he did the enemy, and never failed to express himself with a frankness and familiarity which would not have been tolerated from any other general. Ney commanded the Sixth Corps. The bravest of the brave occupied a unique position in the army. His good nature made him a general favorite with his officers and men. Like many of his associates, he did not understand war on the map, but on the field of battle he had no equal. He was at his best in command of the rear guard of a retreating army. In Portugal and in Russia he proved himself a great soldier. In his career there is much that is pathetic which blots out his faults and compels our admiration. Augereau was put in charge of the Seventh Corps, which was formed later at Brest. His imposing personal appearance and martial air had made his fortune, but he did little in later campaigns to justify the reputation he had gained in Italy. Bessières commanded the Imperial Guard, with which his name will forever be associated. Acting always under the personal orders of the Emperor, he never had any opportunity to establish a reputation for originality or independence. Murat was at the head of the reserves of cavalry. He is, perhaps, the most picturesque figure among Napoleon's generals. He owed his position more to his connection by marriage with the Emperor than to his military merits. With but limited intelligence, brave to a fault, vain and ambitious, he was the beau idéal of the leader of a cavalry charge. But he was not in any sense a great cavalry general, and even on the battlefield frequently handled his men badly. The commanders of the Grand Army were remarkable for their comparative youth. Napoleon was 36, and Soult, Lannes, and Ney were the same age. Davout was a year and Murat 2 years younger, while Marmont was only 31. The oldest were Bessières, 37, Bernadotte, 42, and Augereau, 48. Among the division commanders were many men who attained great distinction in after years. Oudinot, Suchet, and Grouchy all later made marshals. Vandamme, Dupont, and Saint-Hilaire, all names well known in the history of Napoleon's campaigns, but it is impossible to dwell on them here. From this portrait of Napoleon's marshals it will be seen that with the exception of Davout and Soult, there was none to whom he could then entrust an independent command. The 7 corps, each of from 2 to 4 divisions, varied greatly in numbers, a sure gauge of Napoleon's opinion of the ability of the respective commanders. Augereau had 14,000 men, Bernadotte and Lannes each 18,000, Marmont 21,000, Ney 24,000, Davout 27,000, and Soult 41,000. The Guard under Bessières numbered 6,000, and the cavalry under Murat 22,000, a grand total of 191,000 men. At this time Masséna, with 50,000 men in Italy, was opposed to the Archduke Charles with double his forces. Masséna, whom Napoleon called l'enfant chéri de la victoire, was the ablest of the marshals and the one best fitted for independent command. At Zurich and in the defence of Genoa he had showed great vigour. He was a man of strong character, tried courage, and great resolution. He ranked very high among the generals of the day. At that time he was in his 50th year. The brain, the soul of the whole organization, was Napoleon himself. He alone commanded in chief, combining in his own person the functions not only of head of the state, but also of generalissimo, and of chief of staff in fact, if not in name. Herein lay the great defect of his military organization, which became more and more evident with the growth of his armies in later years. Napoleon was fortunate enough never to be wounded but once, and then not seriously, and he had an iron constitution which bore all the fatigues of his numerous campaigns. But if anything had happened to him at a critical moment, there was no one to replace him. Berthier, the nominal chief of staff, was only a very able and very useful head clerk, who received in the name of the Emperor the reports of the marshals and signed his orders for him. The only time that he ever had the opportunity of acting on his own initiative, at the beginning of the Wagram campaign, he nearly brought the army to disaster. If the senior Moltke had been killed or fallen sick, there were many officers on the Prussian staff who could have filled his place with credit, but Napoleon was the one star performer who never had an understudy. During his campaigns Napoleon was always accompanied by Berthier, Duroc, and Caulaincourt, besides several secretaries and a crowd of aides de camp. Duroc did not possess a brilliant mind, but was faithful and upright, and very useful to the Emperor, whose entire confidence he possessed. Caulaincourt was always by the Emperor's side, his duty being to accompany him everywhere. He was an excellent general officer, frank and loyal, and loved and esteemed by all. After the death of Duroc in 1813, he combined the duties of Grand Marshal with those of Chief Equerry. The above-mentioned officers, with numerous attendants and servants, constituted the Emperor's military household, which at the end of 1806 numbered 800 persons. The Emperor's personal domestic staff consisted of Constant, his head valet de chambre from 1800 to 1814, and 3 assistants. Next to Constant, the most intimate of Napoleon's servants was the Mameluke Roustan, who always guarded him at night, and acted as outrider by day, carrying his greatcoat and portmanteau. To complete the description of the Emperor's household, it remains to speak of his staff of secretaries, who were very few in number for the arduous duties required of them. Napoleon did not like new faces, consequently he had from 1796 to 1815 only 3 private secretaries. Bourrienne, his old school friend, whom he was obliged to dismiss for dishonesty in 1802, Meneval, who was in all the campaigns of the Empire until 1813, and finally Fane. During a campaign it was Napoleon's custom to remain at headquarters until the last moment, and then travel rapidly by carriage so as to be at the head of his corps the moment his presence was necessary. The interior of his travelling carriage was so arranged that he could use it as a bed by night, and so travel without fatigue. For the past 80 years the most interesting exhibit at Madame Tussaud's in London has been the last travelling carriage used by Napoleon, which was captured by the Prussians after the battle of Waterloo. It was built for him in 1811, and was employed during the Russian campaign of 1812 and the following year in Germany. It carried him from Fontainebleau to the coast in 1814, and from Paris to Belgium in June, 1815. In general design it may be described as a two-seated berline de voyage. The coach is very heavily and strongly built, and the exterior is very plain, the only mark of distinction being the imperial arms emblazoned on the door panels. The body is swung on thick leather straps attached to strong C-springs. At the four corners of the body there are square black metal lamps made to take large wax candles. A travelling trunk was carried behind on a rack. The coach was drawn by 6 heavy Norman horses, 4 driven by the coachman, and the leaders under control of a postillion. The interior is more interesting than the exterior. There are 2 deep and roomy seats divided by a movable arm rest. High up in the front of the vehicle are a pair of windows, beneath which, in the space usually occupied by the front seat, there is a curious bulkhead or boot which constitutes the most unusual feature of the carriage. Folding into this receptacle opposite the right-hand seat used by the Emperor, there is a well-appointed desk which when drawn out comes over to the back seat. Behind this there is a secret compartment for money and objects of value. Below these fittings there is a large cloth-covered door, hinged to open towards the middle of the coach, so that it divides the lower portion of the interior into 2 separate parts. When so placed it exposes a large cavity forming the foot of the sleeping compartment. Here, neatly encased within a receptacle 6 inches deep and 3 feet high, folded, ready to be withdrawn at a moment's notice, is Napoleon's bedstead. When connected by a board with the seat, which constituted the head of the bed, this formed a very comfortable couch, on which the Emperor could repose at full length. In the same space were carried the mattress and bed linen. The other side of the carriage is similarly arranged, but with drawers in place of the desk. In these were carried toilet articles and a complete table service. The interior is lined throughout with dark blue cloth, and there is an oil reading lamp in the centre of the back of the carriage. When at the head of his troops the Emperor rode on horseback. He had a bad seat, and was only a mediocre horseman, but his endurance, until he became stout after the age of 40, was remarkable. In Spain in 1809 he covered the distance from Valladolid to Burgos, nearly 80 miles in 5 hours. In such cases he had relays and changed horses every 10 or 15 kilometers. He usually rode small white Arabian horses, the appearance of which is familiar to us from Meissonier's paintings. They were good-tempered, gentle gallopers and easy amblers, and trained with the greatest care so as to be accustomed to all sorts of sounds and the sight of all kinds of objects. The white steed Marengo, which he rode at Waterloo, lived to take part in his funeral procession in 1840. At his headquarters in the field, whether temporary or permanent, Napoleon always required, besides his sleeping room, an office, in the centre of which was a table with his map spread out. In the corners of the room were tables for his secretaries. The Emperor usually retired at 8 o'clock, after dinner, and rose again about 1 or 2 in the morning, when the reports began to come in. On the map, which was surrounded by 20 or 30 candles, the positions of his corps, and also of the enemy as far as known, were marked by pins. It was on this that he worked, moving his compass, open to the scale of 6 to 7 leagues, the length of a march. As soon as he had made up his mind he began to dictate his orders rapidly while walking around the room. It was always difficult for his secretaries to keep pace with him. As soon as the orders were written out they were presented for his initial, an abstract was made for the files, and the orders were then dispatched to the different marshals, so that the corps would be ready to march at daybreak. It is remarkable that Napoleon made large use of civilians for the secretariat of his staff. Notwithstanding his faults, Napoleon's staff system worked admirably in his own hands. The coalition plan of campaign was for 60,000 Austrians and 90,000 Russians to operate in the Danube Valley under Archduke Ferdinand, with Mack as his chief of staff, while 150,000 Austrians, under Archduke Charles, were to be in Italy on the Adige, where the main attack was to be delivered against the French, who were expected to be under the personal command of Napoleon. But Napoleon gave Massena the command in Italy with a strong corps, and ordered him to contain the Austrians there until the campaign took a decisive turn in Germany, while he himself took the command of the Grand Army of 7 corps with a strength of about 200,000. At the outset the campaign took a favourable turn for Napoleon when Mack issued orders for his troops to cross the frontier at once, without waiting for the Russians, with the idea of cutting off Bavaria from her alliance with France. The 6 French corps left their camps on the 27th of August, and the Guard left Paris the same day. All had orders to march by the shortest way to the Rhine and the Maine, with a general line of direction on Ulm. The distance from Boulogne to Strasbourg is about 300 miles, and the troops covered it in 29 days, crossing the Rhine on the 27th of September. Napoleon himself left Paris the 23rd September, and was at Strasbourg 3 days later. There he learned that Mack had entered Ulm on the 20th. Continuing his advance, and finding no signs of Mack, Napoleon crossed the Danube on the 7th of October, leaving only the corps of Ney on the north side to bar the roads from Ulm to Bohemia. Forming his troops into 3 groups, the Emperor directed Lannes and Murat to march on Ulm, while Bernadotte and Marmont were to advance on Munich, and hold off the Russians who were erroneously reported to have arrived there. Napoleon himself, with the 2 strong corps of Soult and Davout, advanced on the 10th to Augsburg, where he was in a position to support either Murat or Bernadotte according to circumstances. While Napoleon was breaking up the camp at Boulogne the last of August, Mack had marched into Bavaria to force her either to join the coalition or remain neutral. The Bavarians fell back to Bamberg, and Mack took up a position between Ulm and Lake Constance to await the arrival of the Russians, who were still 250 miles away and could not be expected before the middle of October. He was looking for the French, who had usually advanced through the Black Forest to follow the customary route. About this time he received the news that Napoleon with his main army was coming to Germany and not going to Italy. He immediately gave orders to change the direction of large bodies of troops which were marching to Italy, but it was too late to do any good. All of Napoleon's movements up to his arrival at Stuttgart had escaped Mack's knowledge. Finding at last that Napoleon was on the way to envelop his right flank and cut off his line of communications, in 6 days he made no less than 6 different plans to escape from the net fast closing around him, but all in vain. He tried, first, to oppose Napoleon's crossing the Danube; next, to retreat through Augsburg; then to cross the Danube to the north; then to retreat by way of Ulm into Bohemia; then, after determining to remain in Ulm, he finally again decided to retreat into Bohemia. But it was now too late. Napoleon was advancing on both banks of the river, and on the 15th Mack was driven back into the fortress, which was now entirely dominated. On the 17th of October he surrendered with 23,000 men. 2 large detachments which attempted to escape were also surrounded and captured. In all 50,000 Austrians were taken prisoners. Only Archduke Ferdinand with a small force succeeded in getting away safely. The Austrians had been beaten almost without firing a shot. It was a repetition on a larger scale of the strategy of Marengo. "The whole Ulm manoeuvre," says Dodge, "is one of the very finest in history." Napoleon immediately turned back his main body to join Bernadotte and concentrate his forces. This was accomplished on the 25th, when the French were about 225 miles from Vienna, to which they now advanced rapidly. On the 13th November, Murat seized the bridge across the Danube at Vienna by a stratagem, so that Napoleon could cross the river immediately. The next 2 days he gathered together the troops that had crossed the river and pressed on to Brunn. There he came to a halt, as he had only 50,000 men actually in hand, the Guard and the corps of Lannes and Soult. In spite of the great success of his campaign up to this point, the position of Napoleon was really critical. The French army was 400 miles from its base, and was much weakened by detachments. Its long line of communications ran through southern Germany, which was friendly, but to the north Prussia was beginning to arm. Winter was already at hand, and both the Emperor and his soldiers were anxious to be back in France. The Czar believed that Napoleon had only a very weak force at Brunn, so he decided to attack him there, which was exactly what Napoleon wanted. The Allies advanced so slowly that the Emperor had ample time to concentrate his forces. On the 30th November the French outposts were driven in. Napoleon immediately penetrated the designs of the allies, and did his best to encourage them. He drew his troops slowly back, and took up a position which he had selected between Brunn and Austerlitz, which lent itself well to the turning movement at which the allies were aiming. There the French army took station on the night of the 1st of December, while Kutusoff disposed his troops on the rising ground opposite. The terrain of Austerlitz is very much broken. There are a number of hills and valleys which will hide large bodies of troops. In the square of say 10 miles from east to west by 7 miles from north to south, the fortress city of Brunn occupies the northwest corner, and past it in a marshy lowland a mile wide flows the Schwarzenau River, bordering the field on the west. From the river to the east the ground rises and falls in a gradual ascent to the plateau of Pratzen, which occupies the centre of the theatre, and from thence it gradually descends to the town of Austerlitz. Southwest of Pratzen, on the southern boundary of the square, there are 2 large ponds. The plateau is skirted on the west by a brook called Goldbach, and on the east and south sides flows the Littawa River. The road from Brunn to Vienna runs due south along the west bank of the Schwarzenau. The country is dotted with villages which are connected by good dirt roads. There are few woods, and the theatre, though full of hills and dales, forms a good field of manoeuvre. At the time of the battle the ponds were frozen, and the ice on the marshy ground gave a secure footing. Napoleon, who had been on the ground for several days, had been in the saddle most of the time, and ridden over the entire country to the north of the Littawa. Any ordinary general would have occupied the heights of Pratzen, and fought a defensive battle, but he wanted a fight to a decision, and not "only an ordinary battle," as he expressed it. The trained eye of Napoleon had not failed to catch the intention of the allies, which was by a wide circuit of the French right flank to seize the road running south from Brunn, cut him off from Vienna, and recover the capital. This would also enable them to join hands with Archduke Charles, who was coming up from Italy. As a strategic measure their course was proper, but from the tactical standpoint the long circuit was an error, and just one of those which Napoleon liked to see his enemies commit. Their manoeuvre would enable him to pierce their centre, cut them in 2, and decisively defeat them. "To the average commander," says Dodge, "it would have been a gambling transaction. To Napoleon it was betting on a certainty." With this object in view, Napoleon left the Pratzen to be occupied by the enemy, and drew up his army behind the brook with his left flank on the Santon Hill, which he had caused to be strongly entrenched. Lannes was at the left, Soult in the centre, and Davout, who had just arrived, at the right. Bernadotte also came up in the afternoon, and went into position between and to the rear of Lannes and Soult. Murat and the cavalry were placed behind Lannes. Bessières, with the guard in reserve, was back of Bernadotte in the vicinity of the hill where the Emperor had his bivouac. The French right, under Davout, was intended to contain the allied left, which was reaching around to the Vienna road until the moment arrived for Napoleon, with his massed left and centre, to take advantage of any opening. The Emperor had by his side Berthier, Junot, his first aide de camp, and all his staff. Near by stood the guard. As from his bivouac he calmly watched the movements of the allies, Napoleon saw his judgment confirmed that they were attempting to turn his right, and that in so doing their right and left wings would get separated by the plateau of Pratzen, which would give him an opportunity to break through the centre. The allies were convinced that the French would fight a defensive battle, and their only fear was that they would try to escape. During the afternoon of the 1st, contrary to his usual habit, the Emperor assembled his marshals, and explained to them in detail his plan of battle, and told each one the rôle which was assigned to him. Napoleon was so confident of victory that he even went so far as to explain to his soldiers what he was about to do. In a proclamation to the army he said, "While they are marching to turn my right, they will present me their flank." During the evening, when the Emperor made the round of the bivouacs, he was greeted with the utmost enthusiasm. It was the eve of the 1st anniversary of his coronation. In an instant torches of straw were put at the top of thousands of poles, and from 70,000 throats there came a simultaneous cry of "Vive l'Empereur!" At 1 o'clock the Emperor retired, and took a short rest until between 4 and 5, when the troops began to move into their respective places. He then took his station on the bivouac hill, with the marshals around him, ready to receive their final orders. A thick fog covered the landscape, but by 7 o'clock the tops of the hills began to appear. Suddenly the sun of Austerlitz burst forth in all its glory, and showed the heights of Pratzen for the moment denuded of troops. The enemy, as he expected, had weakened his centre, and given Napoleon the opportunity he sought. The allied left, 30,000 strong, was marching to turn the French right and seize the Vienna road. Turning to Soult, whose troops were massed in 2 lines of battalions in column of attack, the Emperor asked, "How long a time do you require to reach the heights of Pratzen?" Soult replied, "Less than 20 minutes." "In that case, let us wait a quarter of an hour more." In the meantime the strong allied force was making good progress against the French right, and their heads of columns were getting well across the Goldbach. But Davout, fighting with his usual stubbornness, was keeping the Russians in check, and this flank was never in any real danger. It was nearly 9 o'clock when Napoleon finally gave the order for Soult to attack, and his force was soon in rapid motion towards the plateau of Pratzen. The other marshals, Murat, Lannes, and Bernadotte, galloped down from Bivouac Hill to head their respective corps. Napoleon had been remarkably accurate in his timing. At this moment an allied column, accompanied by headquarters, the Czar, and Kutusoff in person, was climbing the opposite side of the plateau. This force was marching in route order, thinking that the French were yet far distant. On reaching the brow of the plateau the Russian commander was astonished beyond measure to see the French about to assault the hill with a force far outnumbering his own. Realizing his danger, Kutusoff made a brave resistance, but was soon driven back down the hill. While the possession of Pratzen was being contested, Lannes, Murat, and Bernadotte were delivering a strong attack on the left and gaining ground steadily. Here there was a sharp fight between the French cavalry under Murat and the Imperial Russian Guards, commanded by Grand Duke Constantine. To put an end to this conflict, Napoleon ordered in Bessieres with the cavalry of the Imperial Guard, and these superb squadrons easily rode down the Russian cavalry. Bernadotte and Lannes again advanced, and by 11 o'clock the whole Russian right was in full retreat on Austerlitz. In the meantime, far away to the south, the allied left was being held in check by the superb work of the French right under Davout. A huge gap of 3 miles lay between the 2 allied wings, where Soult was driving back the weak allied centre. As an exhibition of grand tactics, Austerlitz will ever remain a model. Before noon Soult was in full possession of the Pratzen. The allied army had been cut in 2, and their left, fighting on the Goldbach, had been caught in the triangle between the brook, the ponds, and the Litois, with its line of retreat completely severed. The Emperor had followed the advance of his left wing until he saw that there was no further danger from that quarter. He then galloped over to Soult, followed by the Guard. In passing, he told his men that the battle was won, and the cheers swept like a tidal wave along the entire line. Soult now turned south from the Pratzen and took the allied line in reverse, while Davout, who had been standing on the defensive, attacked in force. By 2 o'clock the Russians were completely surrounded, and men and guns were captured by wholesale. 2,000 men attempting to cross the ponds were destroyed by the French artillery, which broke the ice. From St. Anthony's Chapel, south of the Pratzen, the Emperor watched the destruction of the allied left wing. At the fall of night the valley of the Litois separated the 2 armies. The French bivouacked in the position the Allies had held the night before. The 2 emperors were at Austerlitz, preparing to retreat into Hungary. Napoleon had under his colors at Austerlitz about 65,000 men, and his losses were not far from 7,000. The Allies put in line about 85,000, and their loss in killed, wounded, and missing was fully 25,000 men and 160 guns. But these losses are no adequate measure of the victory. The beaten army was completely demoralized. There was no longer any organized force, only a disordered band of marauders. Few victories have been more splendid than Austerlitz, or better deserved. Napoleon never ceased to feel that Austerlitz was his most brilliant battle. Marengo, Ulm, Jena were battles won as the result of able strategic combinations. Rivoli, Austerlitz, Dresden exhibited Napoleon's grand tactics on the battlefield as the others did not. At dusk Napoleon rode over the field, according to his habit, addressing each regiment as he passed, for he knew by heart the history of every one. To the 57th he said, "Remember, years ago, I named you the Terrible." The infantry of the Guard shed tears of rage at not having been put in. By midnight Napoleon took up his quarters at the house of Possositz, about 3 miles northwest of Austerlitz, on the road from Brunn to Olmutz. Hither at early dawn on the 3rd came Prince Liechtenstein from the Emperor Francis with the request for a truce and a personal interview. The message from the Austrian Emperor was the first intimation Napoleon had of the full effects of his victory, and he resolved at once to secure all its fruits. He refused the truce, but made an appointment to meet Francis on the following day. At the same time he gave Murat orders to pursue the enemy. To Talleyrand, who was at Vienna trying to arrange terms of peace, he sent a courier saying, "I can write you only 2 words. An army of 100,000 men, commanded by the 2 emperors, is entirely destroyed. All protocols become unnecessary. The negotiations become null." On the afternoon of the 4th, the Emperor of Austria visited Napoleon at his headquarters near the mill of Saroschitz, where an agreement was made to stop hostilities. The Russians were to retire to Poland, and terms of peace were to be arranged at once at Pressburg. By the treaty signed the 26th of December, 1805, Austria paid heavily. To Italy she ceded Venetia and part of Istria and Dalmatia, and to Bavaria the Tyrol. The King of Naples ceased to reign. The electors of Bavaria and Würtemberg were recognized as kings, and so, by the irony of fate, Napoleon bestowed a crown on the daughter of George III. The Peace of Pressburg shattered the third coalition organized by William Pitt. When the news of Austerlitz reached London, Pitt was already on his deathbed. He asked to have the map of Europe unrolled before him. After gazing long and steadily upon it, he said, "Henceforth we may close that map for half a century." On the 23rd of January, 1806, he passed away at the age of 47, exclaiming with his dying breath, "Alas, my country!" The coalition, already dismembered, had lost its soul. End of chapter 12.